Stoicism, a philosophy that has been a source of wisdom for generations, is a powerful tool for finding balance amidst the chaos of modern life. Its teachings are not limited to self-control and the pursuit of virtue, but also apply directly to our interpersonal relationships. And as we all know, the people we choose to associate with can have a profound impact on our emotional well-being, our peace of mind, and our mental health. In this video, we will explore a topic that is fundamental for all those who seek to live more fully and in tune with Stoic principles. The types of people we should avoid, those we should not trust. Stoicism teaches us that wisdom lies in identifying what is beyond our control and not allowing these external factors to disturb us. However, there are people whose behaviors and attitudes can indeed affect our peace of mind. These people are often not bad by nature, but their attitudes can be toxic and harmful to our inner life. With this in mind, let's analyze 10 types of people that Stoicism warns us to avoid and how we can, based on the principles of this philosophy, deal with these situations to preserve our inner peace and move towards a more harmonious and virtuous life. In this video, we will discover how Stoicism offers us tools to filter our relationships, distancing ourselves from those who can destabilize us, and focusing on what is truly important for our personal and emotional evolution. Before we start, subscribe to the channel and like the video. Get ready for a journey of deep reflection on how we can apply these teachings to improve our social and emotional lives while remaining true to our values. The first type, people who always seek external approval. People who constantly depend on external validation tend to be emotionally unstable, as their self-esteem is tied to the opinions of others. They seek approval at every turn, whether at work, in relationships, or on social media. The problem with this type of behavior is that it creates an emotional dependence on other people's feedback, which undermines our autonomy and, eventually, our peace of mind. Stoicism teaches us that true happiness and peace come from within, not from external factors. According to the Stoics, we should live in harmony with our reason and not allow others to dictate our self-worth. Epictetus, one of the main Stoic philosophers, said that it is not things that disturb us, but our opinion of them. In other words, how we react to the behavior of others is what determines our suffering, not the actions themselves. People who constantly seek external approval end up creating a vicious cycle of insecurity, because approval is never enough. Even if they receive praise or recognition, the need for validation never diminishes. This can be exhausting, both for the person who depends on that validation and for those around them. Furthermore, this relentless search for approval from others can lead to poor choices, as these people often act according to what others expect of them, rather than according to their own values and principles. This can result in a life full of regrets and disappointments. What Stoicism teaches us here is that we should be self-reliant in our self-esteem and actions. We should act according to what we know is right, without worrying unduly about what others think. This does not mean being insensitive or selfish, but rather being true to ourselves and our own values. Practicing detachment from external opinions is a daily exercise. The Stoics recommend reflecting on our actions based on reason and virtue, rather than on the desire to please others. If we truly want to grow and achieve inner peace, we need to learn to approve of ourselves before seeking the approval of anyone else. The second type, people who take advantage of our goodwill. This type of person has the ability to identify those who are generous and willing to help. But instead of reciprocating or acting in a way that is mutually beneficial, they take advantage of this willingness to help themselves. They may play the victim or constantly ask for favors without ever returning them or showing gratitude. Although they may seem charismatic and friendly at first, The truth is that they are simply seeking to exploit the goodwill of others to meet their own needs. From a Stoic perspective, generosity should be practiced in a fair and balanced way. The philosopher Seneca states that true generosity does not demand recognition or return, but that it should also not be used as an excuse to be manipulated. What the Stoics emphasize is that we should be generous in a measured way, knowing that there is a limit to how much we can give without receiving the respect and consideration we deserve in return. People who take advantage of our goodwill often lack empathy for our limitations. They can use our kindness until exhaustion sets in, without any sign of reciprocity. This can lead to emotional exhaustion, as in the long run we start to feel exploited, tired, and even devalued. Stoicism teaches that we should act rationally and fairly in all our relationships. When we help someone, we should do so without expecting anything in return, but we should also be aware that our actions should be balanced and not become a field for exploitation. Practicing wisdom allows us to discern when we are being taken advantage of and when our help is actually benefiting the other person in a healthy way. Dealing with these people requires setting firm boundaries, which can be done through practicing self-discipline and self-care. Stoicism teaches us that we should always prioritize what is most important to our well-being, without sacrificing our own needs for the sake of others. By doing this, we can maintain healthier relationships while also preventing our kindness from being used in manipulative ways. The third type, people who avoid responsibility. This type of person is one of the most challenging in our daily interactions, as they refuse to take responsibility for their actions and choices. Instead, they blame others or external circumstances for everything that goes wrong. These individuals are masters at shifting blame away from themselves, avoiding the self-awareness and reflection needed to learn from their mistakes. According to Stoicism, the only thing we have the power to control is our own response to events. The philosopher Epictetus once said that although we cannot control external events, we can control our attitude towards them. By avoiding responsibility, a person creates an illusion of control over the situations around them, but deep down, they are only moving away from true self-knowledge and the possibility of growth. This behavior can be extremely harmful because by not taking responsibility, the person ends up repeating the same mistakes and creating a cycle of negativity. Furthermore, when we are around someone who never takes responsibility, we are often dragged into this cycle of guilt and frustration. From a Stoic perspective, responsibility is one of the central principles of a virtuous life. Only by taking responsibility for our actions can we truly learn and evolve. This involves being honest with ourselves, acknowledging our mistakes, and most importantly, correcting our course when necessary. Stoicism teaches us that by becoming aware of our choices and actions, we find immense power to change our reality. When dealing with people who avoid responsibility, the most important thing is not to fall into their attitude of avoiding their own mistakes. This can be done by maintaining a firm and rational stance, accepting that often our only responsibility is to choose how we react to these situations and not allow them to affect us emotionally. The fourth type, people who promote constant negativity. Constant negativity is a behavior that drains our energy and creates an emotionally toxic environment. People who are always focused on the negative side of everything, whether at work, in relationships, or in life in general, can infect us with their pessimistic outlook. These people seem to see problems in everything and have a tendency to complain about everything that happens around them without ever seeing a solution or an opportunity to learn. Stoicism, on the other hand, teaches that we should focus on what is within our control and learn to deal with what we cannot change in a rational and calm manner. Marcus Aurelius, one of the greatest Stoics, stated that we should do good and expect good, without clinging to the idea that life will always live up to our expectations. In other words, we should be prepared to deal with challenges constructively, without allowing ourselves to be dragged down by the negativity of others. Living with negative people can have a profound impact on our emotional state. If we are constantly exposed to pessimistic thoughts and defeatist attitudes, we run the risk of internalizing these beliefs and beginning to see the world through the same lens. Stoicism teaches us to develop resilience in the face of adversity and to focus on what we can control to improve our situation without getting lost in the opinions of others. The Stoic teaching for dealing with such people is simple. We must set boundaries and not allow their opinions to influence our worldview. Instead of allowing ourselves to be infected by negativity, we can practice distinguishing between what is within our control and what is not. This allows us to maintain inner peace, regardless of what others around us may be thinking or saying. Fifth type, people who do not practice self-knowledge. Self-knowledge is one of the cornerstones of Stoic philosophy. The constant practice of reflecting on oneself, one's thoughts and actions, allows us to act with greater clarity and wisdom. However, there are people who avoid or simply do not dedicate themselves to this process of introspection. They live impulsively, guided by momentary emotions, and rarely question their motivations, desires, or long-term goals. These people often find themselves in a cycle of dissatisfaction because they don't know what they really want, and their actions are reactive rather than based on clear intention. Stoicism, in contrast, encourages constant self-evaluation. Seneca advised, "Do not consider yourself wise, but always consider yourself a learner." Practicing self-awareness allows us to be humble about our journey and to understand our own flaws, strengths, and limitations. When we are surrounded by people who do not practice self-awareness, interactions can become disorganized and disorienting. They often make decisions based on emotions or momentary impulses, without reflecting on the consequences of their actions. This can lead to instability and frustration, especially in work environments or in personal relationships. Stoicism teaches us that we need to develop a clear and self-aware mind in order to make wise decisions. By practicing self-reflection, we can identify patterns of behavior that prevent us from evolving and making choices that are more aligned with our deepest values. This involves the daily practice of thinking about our actions, meditating on our failures, and learning from our mistakes. When dealing with people who do not seek to understand themselves, we must remember that we cannot change others, but we can choose how we respond. The most important thing is not to allow their lack of self-awareness to affect our own growth. Instead of being affected by their lack of reflection, we can serve as positive role models by practicing self-awareness in our own lives. Sixth type, overly controlling people. Excessive control is one of the characteristics that most distances people and harms interpersonal relationships. People who try to control every aspect of other people's lives, whether they are friends, family, or co-workers, create an environment of tension and frustration. They not only disrespect the freedom and autonomy of others, but they also demonstrate a deep internal insecurity, trying to compensate for their fear of losing control by imposing their will. Stoicism, on the other hand, teaches that true control comes from within. We should focus on controlling our own reactions and emotions rather than trying to manipulate or dominate others. Epictetus said, "Do not seek to have events happen as you wish, but wish that they happen as they happen." This principle reflects the idea that we cannot control the actions of others, but we can control our response to them. Those who are overly controlling have difficulty accepting this and often try to impose their worldview on those around them. Dealing with controlling people can be difficult, as they try to manipulate the situation to align with their wishes. This behavior can lead to feelings of frustration and helplessness, as people around these controlling figures may feel that their autonomy is being undermined. This affects not only relationships, but also the emotional well-being of everyone involved. According to Stoicism, we should act with self-discipline and acceptance. When dealing with controlling people, it is important to maintain our own autonomy and set clear boundaries without giving in to the desire to control or be controlled. The most important thing is to remember that true peace comes from accepting what we cannot control and acting wisely in the situations that are within our control. Seventh type, people who create unnecessary conflicts. People who constantly create unnecessary conflicts in personal, professional, or social relationships are undoubtedly sources of stress and frustration. They may do so for a variety of reasons, such as a desire to attract attention, a pleasure in disagreement, or simply a lack of emotional skills to deal with differences in a healthy way. Regardless of the reason, these people are often disruptive, creating an environment of tension where peace and harmony are difficult to achieve. In Stoicism, the practice of temperance and moderation is essential to avoid conflict and maintain tranquility. Marcus Aurelius, in his Meditations, constantly reflected on how to deal with difficult people and how to maintain inner peace, even in the face of hostile or provocative behavior. He said, "Peace is a refuge of wisdom." This teaches us that we should not react impulsively to conflicts, but rather seek wisdom to resolve situations constructively. People who create unnecessary conflict are often not open to dialogue or peaceful resolution. They seek to fight, confront, and divide rather than trying to reach solutions that benefit everyone. When we are surrounded by these types of people, it is important to remember that conflict never leads to growth and that we can choose not to enter into this dynamic. The Stoic response to this behavior is not to react with hostility. Instead, we should try to understand their motivations, act with compassion and wisdom, and when necessary, set firm boundaries so that we do not engage in pointless disputes. Eighth type, people with a lack of empathy. A lack of empathy is one of the most challenging qualities in any relationship. When someone is unable to understand or care about the feelings and needs of others, it creates a cold and disconnected environment. People who lack empathy often act selfishly, making decisions based on their own interests without considering how it will affect others. Stoicism teaches that to live according to virtue, we need to practice understanding and solidarity in all our relationships. Seneca reminds us that there is nothing more worthy of a man than to act with empathy, always seeking the well-being of others, without expecting anything in return. The Stoic must be attentive to the needs of others, seeking to act justly and with kindness, without allowing himself to be manipulated or exploited. When we are surrounded by people who do not show empathy, the situation becomes exhausting and emotionally draining. They do not recognize the other person's pain, nor do they make an effort to help, which can generate feelings of loneliness and frustration. In these cases, the Stoic must remain calm and practice healthy emotional distancing without allowing the lack of empathy of others to affect their inner balance. Ninth type, people who seek emotional manipulation. People who practice emotional manipulation often exploit the feelings of others to achieve their own goals. They may use guilt, emotional blackmail, or other methods to control other people's reactions, manipulating their emotions to their advantage. In personal, family, or professional relationships, these people can create a toxic dynamic where victims are unable to act freely or make decisions without feeling pressured or blamed. From a Stoic perspective, emotions should be observed and controlled, not allowing others to use our emotions to manipulate our actions. Epictetus reminds us that we cannot be controlled by others unless we allow them to. This means that when we encounter people who try to manipulate us emotionally, we should be firm in our convictions, not allowing their actions to destabilize us or lead us to do something against our own will. Dealing with emotional manipulation requires a great deal of self-control and clarity of thought. We must practice emotional discipline and maintain our independence, recognizing when we are being manipulated without giving in to external pressures. Stoicism teaches that by acting rationally, we can avoid falling victim to such manipulation, maintaining our peace of mind and acting fairly, regardless of the intentions of others. Furthermore, the Stoics emphasize the importance of authenticity. When dealing with manipulative people, it is essential to maintain a firm and clear stance on our own values and boundaries, without allowing others to distort our perception of ourselves or pressure us to act in ways that are not in line with our ethics. This allows us to act honestly and not be controlled by emotional manipulation. 10th type: people who never learn from their mistakes. People who never learn from their mistakes continue to repeat the same harmful behaviors, regardless of the consequences. They fail to recognize that their choices have an impact, and instead of reflecting on what went wrong, they choose to ignore the lessons that life has to offer. These types of people can be extremely frustrating to be around, as they are in a constant cycle of self-sabotage, affecting themselves and often those around them. Stoicism values continuous learning and reflecting on one's failures. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the key to growth is learning from mistakes, saying, "Our first and most important goal is to learn from our difficulties." Every mistake is an opportunity to learn and improve our way of living. People who fail to recognize the importance of this reflection are missing out on the chance to become better versions of themselves. When we deal with people who don't learn from their mistakes, it can be difficult to see any progress or change. However, Stoic philosophy teaches us not to let others dictate our behavior. Even if the people around us repeat their mistakes, this shouldn't derail us from our own journey of self-improvement. We can offer help and support, but we must understand that true change only occurs when a person decides to take responsibility for their own mistakes. The Stoic practice of self-reflection and self-discipline is essential to avoid falling into the cycle of repeated failure. We should focus on learning from our own mistakes and using those lessons as levers for personal growth. This not only makes us stronger, but it also allows us to deal with those who refuse to learn with more patience and understanding. We conclude that throughout our lives, we come across different types of people who can profoundly impact our well-being and inner peace. Stoicism offers us a way to deal with these situations rationally, without allowing ourselves to be dragged down by the negative emotions that such behaviors can generate. By understanding the different types of people we should avoid or limit our interactions with, we can make wiser decisions and live a life more aligned with our values. Stoic philosophy teaches us that the key to a virtuous life is practicing self-control, wisdom, and resilience in the face of hardship. People who take advantage of our goodwill, avoid responsibility, or create unnecessary conflict can test our patience. But by staying true to Stoic principles, we can preserve our inner peace. We must focus on what is within our control, which is how we respond to these people, and not allow their actions to destabilize us. Furthermore, Stoicism emphasizes the importance of empathy, responsibility, and self-discipline in human relationships. By practicing these virtues, we can not only avoid the traps of toxic people, but also become examples of positive and rational behavior for others. We must remember that while we cannot control the actions of others, we can control how we choose to live. With continued practice of Stoic principles, we can create a more balanced life, more focused on what truly matters, and more resilient to the adversities that come our way. Let's leave it here. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Until later,